I went to my younger brother's wedding expecting to be lonely. I left it engaged to a woman I had met 90 minutes earlier. No, I wasn't drunk. No, it wasn't a dare. And no, she wasn't some reckless mistake I made under fairy lights and champagne. She was the first person in years who made me feel like my life hadn't already ended before it truly began. My name is Jonah Reid. I'm 33. I teach history in a small town called Linden. And until that night, I had spent most of my life believing love was something that happened to other people. But the night my brother got married, I crossed a crowded room to ask a woman sitting alone if she wanted to dance. And somehow by the end of it, I was asking her not to disappear from my life. To understand why I proposed to a stranger before the wedding cake was even cut, you need to know two things about me. First, I never do reckless things, and second, my grandmother once told me that the right woman is usually the one everyone else forgot to notice. That night, I finally understood what she meant. I've lived in Linden my whole life, not passed through it, not moved back after college. I mean my whole life. I was born in the same small hospital on the edge of town where most people in Linden are born. I went to school in the same red brick building where my father once played football and my mother once sang in the spring choir. And now, at 33, I teach history in a classroom just 2 doors down from where I once fell asleep during a lecture on the Roman aqueduct. My students think that's hilarious. They like to joke that I'm proof no one ever really escapes Linden. And I always laugh with them because I know how it sounds. A grown man still living in the town where everybody knows his middle name, where old women at the grocery store still call him Ruth's grandson, where every street corner holds some version of who he used to be. But the truth is I never wanted to escape it, because Linden raised me, not in the sentimental Hallmark way people say that about small towns. I mean it literally. My parents loved me, but they worked long hours when I was a kid. My father taking every overtime shift he could get, my mother leaving before sunrise and coming home too tired to do much more than kiss me on the forehead before bed. So most afternoons I came home to my grandmother's house, to Nana Ruth, and if you had met her you would have understood very quickly why she became the center of my world. Nana always smelled like cinnamon, flour, and the lavender lotion she bought from the pharmacy downtown. She wore faded floral dresses and flower-dusted aprons like they were a uniform she'd earned. The radio in her kitchen was always playing some old big band song from a lifetime before mine, and no matter how tired or irritated or heartbroken you were when you walked through her front door, she had a way of making the whole world feel softer. She believed in old things, handwritten thank you notes, polished shoes. Looking people in the eye when they spoke to you, returning shopping carts, holding doors open, calling when you said you would. But more than any of that, Nana believed that kindness mattered more than charm. She didn't care how smooth a man could talk, how handsome he was, or whether he could make a whole room laugh. To her, character was always revealed in the moments nobody clapped for, in how you treated the lonely person, the awkward person, the person with nothing to offer you back. She used to tell me, over and over, so many times I stopped hearing it for a while, any fool can charm the prettiest girl in the room. Watch the man who crosses the room to ask the woman nobody else sees. That's the one worth knowing. When I was younger, I thought it was just one of those old-fashioned Nana sayings she collected like recipe cards and church bulletins. Something sweet, something harmless, something meant for somebody wiser, older, braver than me. Because if I'm being honest, bravery was never the thing people noticed about me. I was the dependable one, the safe one. The man who showed up early, stayed late, remembered birthdays, helped neighbors move couches, drove friends to the airport, and always knew how to keep a room comfortable. I was the guy people trusted, the guy people called when they needed help. But I was never the guy anyone imagined at the center of a love story, not really. I'd had relationships, sure, a few good ones, a few almosts. A few women I cared about and maybe could have loved if timing had been kinder or if I'd been less afraid of wanting too much. But none of them lasted. And after enough endings that didn't feel dramatic enough to call heartbreak but still hurt enough to leave a mark, I started telling myself a story. That maybe love, the kind that rearranges your life, the kind that chooses you loudly, the kind that makes a man throw caution to the wind and do something wildly out of character, was for people more exciting than me, men who moved to cities, men who took risks, men who knew how to chase what they wanted without apologizing for the noise it made. Not men like me, men who stayed, men who taught sophomore history. Men who spent Friday nights grading essays under a kitchen light in the same town where they learned how to drive. So by the time my younger brother asked me to stand beside him at the altar while he married the love of his life, I was happy for him, truly. I just didn't realize that by the end of that same night my own life would split cleanly into before and after. My brother's wedding was in late June, on one of those golden evenings where the air feels too warm to belong to anybody sad. The ceremony was held at a renovated country estate just outside Linden, white roses on the chairs, string lights hanging from the trees, the kind of place built for photographs people frame for the rest of their lives. And I remember standing in front of the mirror that afternoon, tying my tie for the third time, thinking the same thing I'd been trying not to think for weeks. I really did not want to go to this wedding alone, not because I wasn't happy for Ethan. I was. He was my younger brother, and somehow he'd managed to do what everyone always assumed he would: fall in love young, choose well, and look annoyingly natural doing it. No, what I dreaded wasn't the wedding. It was everything around it, the questions, the looks. The strange little sympathy people reserve for single men in their 30s, as if you've somehow shown up late to a party everyone else got the invitation for years ago. And sure enough, the moment I stepped into that venue, it started. Jonah. Aunt Linda said, appearing beside me with a champagne flute and the kind of expression that meant danger. Are you seeing anyone nice these days? Not are you happy, not how's work, not good to see you, straight to the wound. I gave her the same smile I'd been giving relatives for the better part of a decade, the polite one, the one that said please stop asking before I fake my own disappearance. No one nice enough to survive meeting this family, I told her. She laughed like I was joking. I wasn't entirely. Then my mother found me near the bar, smoothed a hand over my lapel, and smiled in that soft, devastatingly well-meaning way mothers do when they're about to ruin your evening with love. You clean up so well, Jonah, she said. Shame nobody, claimed me like I was a coat at a lost and found. By the time the ceremony ended, I'd already had 3 people ask whether I'd brought a date, one old family friend tell me I was too handsome to still be single, and my brother on his wedding day no less, lean over during cocktail hour and mutter, please flirt with someone before dessert. I can't have my best man looking this emotionally available in all my wedding photos. I told him to focus on getting married and stop trying to outsource my love life between champagne toasts. He just grinned because unlike me, Ethan had always found life funny at exactly the moment it stopped being funny for everyone else. And honestly, by the time the reception started, I almost skipped it. I'm serious. I stood outside the ballroom doors for a full minute, listening to music and laughter spill out into the hallway, and thought about getting in my car, driving home, and claiming a migraine. But then I imagined trying to explain to my mother why her eldest son vanished between the vows and the salad course, so I straightened my jacket, put on my best imitation of a man who wanted to be there, and walked inside. The room was beautiful in a way that almost made it worse. Candlelight flickered across the tables, glasses clinked, couples leaned into each other like they'd forgotten anyone else existed. Bridesmaids kicked off their heels under linen-covered chairs. Someone laughed too loudly near the dance floor, someone else was already crying during the speeches. And because the wedding planner had changed the seating chart at the last minute, I ended up at a table with 4 strangers. A divorced uncle from Claire's side of the family, and a bridesmaid who spent most of dinner texting under the table and pretending she wasn't. I smiled when I was supposed to smile, laughed when other people laughed, nodded through conversations I knew I'd forget by morning. But when Ethan and Claire stepped onto the dance floor for their first dance, something in me went quiet. The room softened around the edges, the music slowed. And for a moment, watching my little brother hold the woman he loved like the rest of the world had finally stopped moving long enough for him to catch up to it, I felt the loneliness hit harder than I expected, not dramatic, not movie scene heartbreaking, just heavy, familiar. The kind of loneliness that doesn't arrive all at once but settles into the empty chair beside you and reminds you it knows the way home. I looked around the room after that, mostly to distract myself. Couples were dancing. Families were taking pictures. Someone's grandmother was waving a napkin in the air like she'd been waiting all year for this exact song, and that's when I saw her. She was sitting near the far edge of the room, just beyond the glow of the dance floor, alone, not hiding, not scrolling through her phone, not wearing that expression people put on when they want the whole world to know they're miserable. She was just watching quietly, like she belonged there and didn't all at the same time. Like she was part of the night, but somehow standing outside of it too. She wasn't the loudest woman in the room, she wasn't trying to be noticed, and maybe that's exactly why I noticed her. There are moments in life that don't feel important while they're happening. They don't arrive with music swelling in the background or some divine voice whispering, pay attention, this is the part that changes everything. They just happen quietly, almost carelessly, a glance across a room, a pause before a decision. A voice in your head that sounds suspiciously like someone you've loved for a very long time. Because the second I saw her sitting there alone, I heard Nana Ruth as clearly as if she were standing beside me in that ballroom, flower on her apron and some old Glenn Miller record playing from the kitchen radio. Any fool can charm the prettiest girl in the room. Watch the man who crosses the room to ask the woman nobody else sees. I wish I could tell you I walked over there without thinking. That I suddenly became one of those men who moves through life with complete confidence, led entirely by instinct and candlelight. I did not. I stood there for a full 10 seconds negotiating with myself like a hostage. You don't know her, she could be waiting for someone, she could say no. You are 33 years old, Jonah, not 16. Why is your heart doing this? But Nana's voice won, it usually did. So before I could talk myself out of it, I straightened my tie, crossed the dance floor and stopped beside her table. Up close, she looked even more striking, not in the loud, polished way some people do, but in a way that made you feel like you interrupted a thought worth hearing. Her dark green dress caught the warm light from the candles. Her hair was pinned back loosely, like she'd given up trying to make it stay perfect an hour ago. And when she looked up at me, there was this flicker in her expression, surprise first, then something softer. Amusement maybe. I held out my hand before my courage could expire. I said, this may be the most awkward possible way to introduce myself, but would you like to dance? She blinked once like she was deciding whether I was serious, then the corner of her mouth lifted. That depends, she said. Are you actually asking me to dance or are you rescuing me out of pity? I laughed partly because she caught me off guard and partly because it was the first honest thing anyone had said to me all evening. Can it be both? That made her smile properly, the kind of smile that doesn't just happen on someone's face but changes the atmosphere around them. That case, she said, slipping her hand into mine, I'd love to. Her name was Avery. She told me that as we stepped onto the dance floor, moving carefully between couples slow dancing under the string lights, while some overly emotional Ed Sheeran song played through the speakers. Avery Collins. She was there because the bride, Claire, was a second cousin on her mother's side, which according to Avery was close enough family to get invited but not close enough to know where to sit, who to talk to, or why 3 different women had already tried to recruit her to help clean up centerpieces later. Basically, she said, glancing around the room, I'm socially stranded. That makes 2 of us, I told her. Really? She asked, raising an eyebrow. You're the groom's brother. This is your natural habitat. You'd think so, I said, but no, I'm more of a decorative family member. They wheel me out for formal events and then put me back in storage. She laughed, an actual laugh, warm and surprised and completely unforced, and I felt something in my chest loosen. It's hard to explain how rare that was, not laughter itself, just ease. Most conversations at weddings feel like job interviews with cake. You ask the usual questions, perform the usual version of yourself, smile at the appropriate moments, and then drift away before either person has said anything real. But talking to Avery didn't feel like that. It felt less like meeting someone and more like picking up a conversation we'd accidentally paused years ago. You know, she said after a moment, studying me with a kind of playful suspicion, most men at weddings either hit on the bridesmaids or hide near the bar. You somehow look like you wandered in from a Jane Austen novel. I laughed. That's because I teach history and panic in social settings. That explains the posture, she said, not the courage. Trust me, this is not courage. This is years of guilt from being raised by a grandmother who believed ignoring lonely women at parties was a moral failure. Ah, Avery said, nodding like that cleared everything up. So I'm not special, I'm a community service project. No, I said before I could stop myself. You're just the only person in this room who looked like she might actually say something interesting. That earned me a look, not flirtatious exactly, not offended either, just interested, like I'd answered a question she hadn't asked out loud. Careful, Jonah, she said. That was almost charming. The thing is, she didn't treat me like the groom's older brother or the lonely single guy at table 7 or the human equivalent of a dependable sedan. She didn't ask me what I did in that vague, polite way people ask when they're waiting to decide how impressed they should be. She asked why I taught history if I could have done anything else. She asked whether I actually liked living in Linden, or if I just said that because it was easier than admitting I was stuck. She asked what kind of music I listened to when nobody else was around. Real questions, dangerous questions if I'm honest. The kind that require you to answer as a person instead of a resume. And somehow with her I did. I told her I taught history because I liked the idea that people could survive impossible things and still leave something worth remembering. I told her I stayed in Linden because every time I thought about leaving, it felt less like freedom and more like betrayal. I told her I listened to old jazz records sometimes because they reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen, and because there was something comforting about music that sounded like it had already forgiven you. Most people would have smiled politely at that and changed the subject. Avery didn't. She just looked at me for a second, really looked at me and said almost softly, you know, for a man who claims to panic in social settings, you say surprisingly intimate things to strangers. I should have been embarrassed. I probably was a little. But standing there with her hand in mine and the lights blurred gold around us, I didn't feel judged. I didn't feel like I was trying to be impressive or funny or smooth enough to earn the next 10 minutes of her attention. I just felt calm, seen maybe, which is a dangerous thing to feel with someone you've only just met. Because once a person sees you clearly, even for a moment, it becomes very hard to go back to being invisible. The song ended. Couples around us began to separate, drifting back toward tables and half-finished drinks and conversations they'd paused 3 minutes earlier. Avery's hand slipped from mine. And then something strange happened. Neither of us walked away. There's a version of that night where the song ends, Avery smiles politely, and we both drift back to our separate corners of the wedding like 2 people who shared a nice dance and nothing more. That's probably the version that should have happened, the normal version. The emotionally responsible version, but neither of us moved. We just stood there for a second in the middle of that crowded dance floor, surrounded by candlelight and people with much simpler evenings ahead of them, looking at each other like we'd both forgot what we were supposed to do next. So, Avery said, tilting her head toward the bar. Do we pretend that was a complete social success and return to our assigned loneliness, or do we risk a second conversation? I laughed. I think I've had enough assigned loneliness for one evening. Good, she said. Because I have opinions about the best man's speech, and I don't think I should be left alone with them. We kept talking. At first, it was easy light, the kind of conversation you can hide inside if you're not ready to admit it matters yet. We made fun of Ethan's speech, which somehow managed to include both an emotional tribute to Claire and a story about getting his head stuck in a porch railing when he was 12. We ranked the worst wedding songs ever written. Avery declared Happy by Pharrell a public nuisance. I argued that Cotton Eye Joe should be classified as psychological warfare. She laughed so hard at that she nearly spilled her champagne. And every time I made her laugh, it felt like discovering something I didn't know I'd been starving for. We danced again when the band switched to something slower, then wandered back toward the edge of the room when the crowd got louder, then danced again. then found ourselves standing near the doors with two untouched drinks and no real reason to stay inside anymore. Come on, Avery said finally, glancing toward the terrace. If I have to listen to one more drunk cousin scream sing along to Bruno Mars, I'm going to fake my own death. We stepped outside, and the second those ballroom doors closed behind us, everything changed. The music softened into a distant pulse. The laughter inside blurred into background noise. Out on the patio, the air was cooler, touched with that late summer softness that makes even strangers feel familiar under string lights. The venue grounds stretched out in front of us, dark trees, glowing lanterns, scattered tables left half empty by guests too busy dancing to remember their drinks. It was quieter out there, honest, somehow. Like the night had finally made room for the part neither of us had been saying out loud. Avery leaned against the railing, looking out toward the gardens instead of at me, and for the first time since I'd met her she seemed tired, not physically, something deeper than that, the kind of tired that comes from holding yourself together in front of other people for too long. I wasn't supposed to be here alone either, she said. The way she said it made me go still, not dramatic, not fishing for sympathy. Just factual in the way people speak when they're finally too exhausted to keep dressing pain up as a joke. I didn't interrupt, I just waited. She gave a small, humorless smile and looked down at the stem of her champagne glass. This year was supposed to look very different, she said. I was supposed to be living in Chicago by now. New apartment, new job, whole fresh start montage. There was even a guy involved for a while, which should have been my first warning sign because I don't trust any life plan that includes a man who says the word synergy unironically. I laughed and she smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Anyway, she continued, the job fell through. The guy turned out to be exactly as emotionally available as a parking meter. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I got very good at telling people I was fine when what I really meant was I had no idea what I was doing anymore. She said it lightly, too lightly, the way people do when they're trying to keep a confession from sounding like one. Yeah, she said, glancing back toward the ballroom. That's how I ended up at a cousin's wedding in a town I barely know, pretending I came here for the chicken and not because I didn't know what else to do with myself tonight. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and felt that strange ache you feel when someone says the quiet part out loud and it sounds too much like your own life. Because I understood that feeling, more than I wanted to admit, I leaned against the railing beside her and stared out at the dark lawn for a moment before answering. I said slowly, I've spent most of my life being useful. Turned to look at me, but she didn't say anything, she just listened. The dependable one, I said. The one who stays, the one who helps, the one who remembers to pick people up from the airport and shows up with jumper cables and extra folding chairs when something goes wrong. I'm the guy everyone trusts because I've built my whole life around being easy to count on. I gave a small laugh then, but there wasn't much humor in it, and I know that sounds noble when you say it fast enough, but if I'm honest, I hesitated. Sometimes I worry I got so good at supporting everyone else's life that I forgot to actually choose one of my own. Didn't move, didn't soften the moment with a joke or rush in with reassurance. She just stood there with that same still, attentive expression she did all night, like she understood that some truths need room to breathe before anyone touches them, so I kept going. I look around sometimes, I said, and it feels like everyone else is moving. Falling in love, getting married, taking risks, making a mess of things and calling it a life. And I'm still standing in the same town in the same routines, telling myself I'm content because I don't know if I'm brave enough to want something bigger than this. The words hung between us for a second, honest, embarrassing, more revealing than I ever would have been with someone I'd known less than an hour. Avery looked at me for a long moment, then set her glass down on the nearest table. Maybe bravery isn't blowing up your life, she said quietly. Maybe it's finally choosing one. I don't know if she understood what that sentence did to me. Maybe she did, maybe that's why she said it so gently, because it hit somewhere deep, somewhere I'd been avoiding for years. We stood there for a moment after that, the kind of silence that doesn't feel awkward because it's carrying too much. Then Avery looked down at her shoes, exhaled, and muttered, "These heels are a hate crime." Before I could answer, she slipped them off one after the other, and stepped barefoot onto the stone patio like she'd just decided she was done performing adulthood for the evening. I laughed. That seems medically unwise. Probably, she said, already walking toward the garden path with her heels dangling from one hand. But so is pretending I'm having a normal conversation with a man who casually says devastating things under fairy lights. I should have stayed where I was. I should have smiled, let her have her moment, and followed at a reasonable emotional distance like the stable adult I'd spent 33 years trying to be. Instead, I followed her past the patio, past the last of the lanterns, across cool stone and trimmed grass and the kind of summer night that makes bad decisions feel suspiciously holy. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the careful one. I didn't feel like the dependable brother or the teacher or the man who always knew exactly where he belonged. I felt young, a little reckless, a little terrified, and more alive than I had any right to feel beside a woman I'd met less than an hour ago. By then I had known her less than an hour, and somehow she already felt more honest than people I'd spent years trying to impress. By the time Avery and I made our way back inside, the reception had crossed into that strange, magical phase every good wedding eventually reaches. The point where the formalities are over, the ties are loosened, somebody's uncle is dancing like he's trying to settle a personal score with the floor, and every glass of champagne feels like permission to become a slightly more reckless version of yourself. The band had gotten louder. The room had gotten warmer. Somewhere between the cake cutting and the bride's college roommate attempting an ill-advised rendition of Man, I Feel Like a Woman, Avery and I had become inseparable enough that people started noticing. Not subtly either. It started with my cousin Melanie, who passed us near the dessert table, looked from me to Avery and back again, and gave me the kind of smug smile usually reserved for people who think they've just uncovered state secrets. "Well," she said, dragging the word out, "this is new." Smiled politely. I pretended not to know what Melanie was implying, mostly because acknowledging it would have required me to examine how obvious it apparently was that I'd spent the last hour orbiting one woman like she had her own gravitational pull. Then my mother found us near the dance floor, carrying a half-empty champagne glass, and wearing the exact expression mothers wear when they're trying very hard not to look too pleased with themselves. She touched my arm, then looked at Avery with immediate approval. "I haven't seen him smile this much in years," she said, not hello, not in who might you be, just a direct announcement to the woman I'd met less than 2 hours earlier that my emotional decline had apparently been visible to my entire family. I said, already regretting my continued existence, but Avery just laughed, and somehow that made it worse because now my mother liked her even more. "Well," Avery said, glancing at me with a kind of mock sympathy, "that feels like a lot of pressure for a first dance partner." "Trust me," I muttered, "if she starts asking about grandchildren, run." "Too late," my mother said brightly before drifting away to terrorize someone else. Avery stared after her for a second, then looked back at me with that amused, sharp-eyed expression I was already learning meant she was about to say something dangerous. "Your family moves fast," she said, "you have no idea." "No, I think I do," she said, nodding toward the room. I followed her gaze and realized at least 3 different relatives were watching us with undisguised curiosity. My aunt was whispering to my cousin. Claire's mother had turned in her chair to get a better look. Even Ethan, who was supposed to be enjoying his own wedding, caught my eye from across the room and gave me a grin so obnoxiously knowing I made a mental note to ruin his honeymoon luggage with contraband fruit. "This is getting ridiculous," I said. Avery murmured. "At this point we should probably just tell them we're engaged." She said it as a joke, lightly, the same way people say impossible things when they know they're safe because no one would ever take them seriously. And I laughed because of course I did. It was absurd, completely insane, the kind of joke two slightly overtired, emotionally overexposed strangers make at a wedding after too much champagne and too many loaded glances from relatives with no boundaries. "Honestly," I said, "that might be the only thing dramatic enough to get them off our backs." "Perfect," Avery said. "You propose, I'll cry convincingly, and your mother can start planning centerpieces by midnight." I should have left it there. I should have laughed, kissed the joke goodbye, and moved on to something safer. Another dance, another drink, another conversation that didn't require me to stand so close to the edge of something I didn't understand yet. Instead, I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out my grandmother's ring. It wasn't an engagement ring, not exactly. Just a simple gold ring Nana Ruth had worn almost every day of her life, plain, warm from years of use. The kind of ring that looked ordinary until you knew how much of a person it had survived with. I'd started carrying it after she died, not for any dramatic reason, mostly because there were days I still missed her so much it felt easier to keep something of hers close, as if grief could be managed with enough small rituals. Avery's expression changed the moment she saw it, the teasing softened. "Jonah," she said, quieter now. "It's okay," I told her. "It's just a ring, she'd probably think this was funny." I looked down at the ring in my palm and smiled despite myself. "Honestly, she'd probably be furious I took this long to talk to you." That made Avery laugh, and before I could think too carefully about what I was doing, I held the ring out toward her with a slight bow dramatic enough to make her roll her eyes. "Avery Collins," I said, just loud enough for the nearest table to hear, "in the interest of giving my family something useful to gossip about for the next decade, would you do me the great honor of pretending to marry me?" She covered her mouth, already laughing. "That," she said, "is without question the worst proposal I've ever heard." "Yet," I said, "I think it has potential." A few people nearby had turned to watch now, smiling the way people smile when they think they're witnessing a private joke but are too nosy to look away. Ethan had actually stopped mid-conversation. Claire had both hands over her mouth. My mother looked 1 second away from calling a priest. Avery looked at the ring in my hand, then at me. There was still laughter in her eyes, but something else too, something gentler, something that made my pulse stumble for reasons I didn't want to examine too closely. "Well," she said at last, holding out her hand, "it would be rude to say no in front of your entire bloodline." I slid the ring onto her finger, and the room around us erupted. My cousin gasped like she'd just witnessed royal history. Someone started clapping. Ethan shouted something deeply unhelpful from across the dance floor. Claire looked delighted. My mother had both hands pressed to her chest like she was trying not to ascend directly into heaven. Avery lifted her hand, admiring the ring with exaggerated seriousness. She said, "That's it, we're committed now. I assume this means I get partial custody of your mother on holidays." I laughed, she laughed, everyone around us laughed, and then we went quiet. It happened in the smallest possible way, no music swelled, no one else noticed. The room kept moving exactly as it had a second earlier, people dancing, glasses clinking, my uncle absolutely butchering the electric slide in the background. But for me, everything narrowed to one impossible image, Avery's hand in mine, my grandmother's ring on her finger, and the look on her face when the joke landed and neither of us knew how to laugh it off anymore. I wish I could tell you there were fireworks, or violins, or some grand cinematic sign from heaven announcing that this was fate and not just a reckless little moment at a wedding reception in Linden, Ohio. There wasn't. There was just one small, impossible silence. One heartbeat suspended in the middle of a crowded room, and the terrifying feeling, sudden and absolute, that my life had been walking toward this woman long before I knew her name. She looked at me, I looked at her. And for the first time that night, the joke didn't feel funny anymore. There's a very specific kind of fear that only shows up when something matters enough to ruin you, not the loud kind, not panic exactly. More like the quiet, nauseating realization that if you don't say something now, if you let this moment pass the way you've let so many other moments pass, you're going to spend a very long time pretending you're fine with losing something you never even gave yourself the chance to keep. That's what it felt like standing there with Avery after the joke had gone quiet. Around us, the wedding carried on. The band was playing something slower now, softer. The kind of song people dance to when the night is winding down and everyone's pretending not to notice it's almost over. Tables were cluttered with empty glasses and half-eaten slices of cake. Someone was gathering purses from the backs of chairs. The older guests had started slipping out one by one, and the room had that unmistakable end-of-the-night feeling, like the magic had begun folding itself away while no one was looking. Avery and I stayed close to each other after that, close enough that people kept smiling at us like they were in on something we hadn't admitted yet, close enough that every time she laughed I felt relief, close enough that every passing minute started to feel less like time spent with her, and more like time running out. Then a little after 11 she glanced toward the doors, then back at me and said the sentence I'd been dreading without even realizing it. I should probably leave soon. Such a normal thing to say, such a harmless sentence. People leave weddings all the time, nights end, strangers go home, real adults smile, say they had a lovely time, maybe exchange numbers if they're feeling optimistic. And then they part ways with dignity and restraint and all the emotional self-control I had apparently misplaced somewhere between the dance floor and my grandmother's ring. But the second Avery said it, something in me dropped, because I knew that version of the story, I knew the shape of it. The almost connections, the almost confessions, the nights that felt important until morning turned them into anecdotes. The people you meet at exactly the wrong time and then spend months pretending you didn't think about afterward. I had lived enough of those stories to recognize one while it was happening. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want fear to be the thing that decided how this one ended. I didn't want to smile politely, hug her goodbye, and spend the next year wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave for just 10 more seconds. So when she said she was going to grab her coat, I told her I'd walk her out. She smiled and said okay. And I spent the entire walk from the ballroom to the front garden trying to figure out whether I was about to do something deeply romantic or genuinely insane. The night air was cooler now, the kind that settles over the world after a long summer day and makes everything feel softer than it did an hour ago. The venue lights glowed gold against the dark. Music drifted faintly from inside, muffled by walls and distance. Somewhere behind us, someone laughed near the parking lot. Avery stopped beneath one of the hanging strings of lights near the garden path and turned to face me, her heels still in one hand, my grandmother's ring still on her finger. "Thank you," she said. "For tonight." 4 words, simple, kind, dangerous, because they sounded too much like goodbye. I looked at her, really looked at her, and all at once every instinct I'd spent years obeying started to feel unbearably small. Be sensible, don't rush, don't embarrass yourself, don't say the thing you can't take back. But another voice was louder now, the part of me that had been waking up all night in pieces every time Avery laughed, every time she looked at me like she could see through every carefully managed version of myself, every time she said something honest enough to make my chest ache. I took a breath, then another. "Avery," she tilted her head slightly. Yeah, and that was it, no perfect setup, no clever line. Just the terrifying moment where you either leap or spend the rest of your life standing safely at the edge of yourself. "I know this is insane," I said, my voice sounded steadier than I felt. "And I know if anyone overhears what I'm about to say, I'm going to sound completely unhinged." Avery blinked once, somewhere between amused and alarmed. I kept going before courage could abandon me. "I don't think what happened tonight was small." I swallowed. "I don't think you were just some woman I met at a wedding. I think I met someone I was supposed to meet." She went very still. "Jonah, I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow," I said quickly. "I know how that sounds. I know we've only known each other for a few hours and that there are at least 7 very reasonable arguments for why I should stop talking right now." That made her laugh once, softly, through her surprise, but I could see tears threatening at the edges of her eyes, and somehow that made me more certain, not less, so I stepped closer, just enough that if she wanted to stop me she could. "I'm asking you not to disappear," I said. "I'm asking if I can call this what it feels like before I lose my nerve. I'm asking if you'll let me put that ring on your finger for real tonight, not because I expect you to build a life with a stranger by morning, but because I want the chance to spend the next year proving I'm not crazy." Heart was beating so hard it felt embarrassing. I could hear my own pulse in the silence that followed. Me court you, I said, quieter now. Let me show up. Let me learn everything I don't know yet. Let me earn this properly. But don't ask me to walk away from tonight and pretend it didn't matter because I can't. I already know I can't. Just stared at me, completely stunned, her mouth parted slightly like she meant to speak and couldn't. Then, to my absolute terror, she laughed, not cruelly, not dismissively, the kind of laugh that slips out when your emotions are too full to come out in the right order. She put one hand over her mouth, looked at me through tears she was no longer even trying to hide, and shook her head in disbelief. Are you always this intense, Mr. Reid? She asked. I let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Only when I'm terrified. That did it. Whatever fragile line she'd been standing on seemed to give way all at once. She looked down at the ring on her finger, then back at me, and something in her expression softened into a kind of wonder I still don't have words for. 1 year, she said. I frowned, not sure I'd heard her right. What? She took one small step closer. 1 year, she repeated, her voice steadier now. You get 1 year to prove this isn't just wedding magic and emotional whiplash. I don't think I breathed. Running, she said. No disappearing when it gets complicated, no pretending this was just a joke if it stops being easy. Throat tight. Okay. And before I marry you for real, she added, finally smiling again through the tears, you are absolutely going to learn my middle name. I laughed, then half from relief, half because it was either laugh or collapse onto the gravel and let the night finish me off completely. That seems fair, I said. Avery held out her hand, the one with my grandmother's ring. Then I guess, she said softly, you'd better make it official. I took the ring from her finger, my hands were shaking, actually shaking. And under the wedding lights, with the music fading behind us and the whole impossible night gathered into that one fragile moment between us, I slid it back onto her hand, not as a joke, not for my family, not for the story, but as a promise. The kind of promise that sounds reckless to everyone else because they don't know how long you've been waiting for something that finally feels like the truth. That was the moment I went from being a man who had wandered into a wedding alone to a man standing under string lights, asking a woman he'd known for only hours to let him spend the next year proving he was worthy of the future he could already see in her eyes. For a long time after that night, people assumed Avery said yes because she was reckless, because the champagne was flowing, because weddings make people emotional, because the whole thing sounded too cinematic to be trusted. And honestly, I understood why they thought that. If someone had told me that story a week earlier, that a woman agreed to wear my grandmother's ring after knowing me for a few hours, I probably would have smiled politely and started looking for the hidden camera. But Avery didn't say yes because she was impulsive. She said yes because, somewhere between the first dance and the last conversation under the wedding lights, I had done something no one else had done for her in a very long time. I made her feel safe. I made her feel chosen. I made her feel seen, not in the shallow, flattering way people often mean when they say that, but in the rarer, quieter way that matters more. The kind that says, I'm paying attention, I'm not trying to win you, I'm trying to understand you later. Months later, when the story had settled into something real enough for us to look back on without laughing first, I asked her why she said yes. And Avery told me something I don't think I'll ever forget. She said, I didn't say yes because it was romantic. I said yes because you crossed a crowded room to ask the one woman nobody else had asked to dance. She smiled when she said it, but her voice had that same softness it got whenever she was telling the truth without trying to protect it. You listened to me, Jonah. You were honest with me. You didn't flirt like it was a performance or talk to me like you were trying to impress me. You made your intentions clear without making me feel cornered by them. Then she looked at the ring on her hand and laughed a little through her own emotion. You offered me something I hadn't seen in a long time, she said. Chemistry, not charm, intention. That word stayed with me, intention, because she was right. I hadn't given her a polished speech or some perfect version of myself designed to earn a yes. I'd just told her the truth, scared, clumsy, unfiltered truth, and maybe that's why she trusted it. I remember looking at her that night under the lights, hearing all of that, and thinking about Nana Ruth, about the kitchen radio and the smell of cinnamon and the way she always made simple things sound like they belonged in scripture. Avery smiled and said, your grandmother sounds like a smart woman. I laughed because smart was one word for Ruth Reid. Terrifyingly perceptive was another. She would have loved you, I said. Avery looked at me for a second after that, really looked at me, and something about the way she smiled made the whole impossible night feel suddenly quiet and sacred. Because in that moment, standing there with my grandmother's ring on her hand and a future neither of us could fully explain unfolding in front of us, I had the strangest, warmest certainty that Nana Ruth had been right all along. Sometimes the right woman isn't the loudest one in the room. Sometimes she's just the one everyone else forgot to notice until the right man finally crosses the room. We didn't get married that night, despite what my mother would have preferred. And despite the fact that for the next 2 weeks, at least half of Linden, Ohio seemed to believe I'd proposed to a mystery woman during my brother's reception, and immediately run off to start a deeply irresponsible life in the mountains somewhere. We didn't do any of that. What we did instead was something much quieter, and the end much harder. We did it right. Avery went back home after the wedding, and for the first time in my life, distance didn't feel like an excuse to retreat. It felt like a test I actually wanted to pass. So I called her the next morning, then the next night, then every day after that until hearing her voice became less like a novelty and more like the shape of my life settling into place. We spent months learning each other outside the magic of that wedding night, not just the charming parts. The real parts, the sleepy versions of ourselves on late-night phone calls, the irritable versions after long work weeks, the quieter fears neither of us had admitted to anyone else. I learned that Avery got silent when she was overwhelmed, not because she wanted distance, but because she'd spent too many years believing her messes were hers to clean up alone. She learned that when I was scared, I tried to become useful instead of vulnerable, fixing problems I hadn't been asked to fix because it felt easier than admitting I didn't know what to do with my own feelings. We fought once or twice, not dramatically, just honestly. The kind of disagreements that stop being about who's right and start being about whether two people are brave enough to stay in the room long enough to understand each other properly. And we stayed, every time we stayed. I drove to see her on weekends until the highway started to feel familiar. She came to Linden and met the version of me that existed outside candlelight and wedding music. The teacher with stacks of ungraded papers in his truck. The grandson who still visited Ruth's grave on Sundays. The man who'd built a whole life in one small town and was finally learning that love might ask him to step beyond it. Avery took risks too, the kind you can't post about or explain neatly to other people. She let herself trust something she couldn't control. She let herself be loved without testing it to death first. She let me into the parts of her life that had been locked up behind competence and humor, and the kind of strength that gets lonely if no one ever asks what it costs. Somewhere in the middle of all that, the joke engagement stopped being a joke. The ring stopped feeling like a story we were borrowing from one strange, beautiful night, and started feeling like the truest promise either of us had ever made. Then, almost exactly 1 year later, I took her back to the same venue, same renovated barn, same summer air, same string lights hanging over the dance floor like the night remembered us. The wedding decorations were gone, the music was different, the room was empty except for us. But the feeling of standing there beside her, of knowing my life had quietly, completely changed in the year since I first crossed that room to ask her to dance, was so familiar it nearly took the breath out of me. This time there was no joke, no audience, no nervous laughter to hide behind, just certainty. I got down on one knee in the same place where our impossible story had first begun, and I asked her the way I should have always asked, clearly, honestly, and with every piece of my future in it. The first time I asked Avery Collins to marry me, I was betting on a feeling. The second time I was betting on a life, and by then I knew I had never made a safer choice. People still ask me if I really got engaged 90 minutes after meeting Avery Collins, and I always tell them the same thing: yes and no. Yes, I slipped a ring onto a stranger's finger that night. Yes, I stood under wedding lights outside my brother's reception and asked a woman I had only known for a few hours not to disappear from my life. Yes, by every normal standard it was reckless, illogical, completely unlike me. But if I'm being honest, I don't think the story really began when I put the ring on her hand. I think it began much earlier than that. I think it began the moment I saw a woman sitting quietly at the edge of a crowded room, unnoticed, unclaimed, pretending not to mind being alone, and heard my grandmother's voice in the back of my mind. I think it began the second I decided to cross that room, because that was the moment something in me changed. The moment I stopped waiting for life to happen to me and finally chose to step toward it. The moment I stopped mistaking caution for safety and loneliness for peace. My grandmother used to say you can learn everything you need to know about a person by watching who they choose when nobody's looking. And maybe she was right. Maybe love doesn't always arrive like lightning. Maybe sometimes it looks much smaller at first. Maybe it looks like a tired woman at a wedding, sitting alone in a room full of people. Maybe it looks like one dance, one honest conversation, one impossible question asked before fear gets the final word. I went to my brother's wedding alone. And I left with something far stranger and far better than a fiancé I never expected. I left with the beginning of the rest of my life. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more.